Thank you very much. So I just need to ask you one question before we get to the other questions. Is this have you seen it in a platform that this president does not support affirmative action? I'm just trying to clarify all the things I thought I believed in.
Listen, if you talk to journalists of color, the kind of access that they had when Bush was in the White House versus this president, and the kind of things that they would talk about that could impact the black community, which they felt they could have because he was a Republican and he's a target. But with this president, the bottom line is we don't want to ask him that. We got to ask him questions that Americans care about, because this is an American president, and especially now that we're going into the general election. People are uncomfortable hearing about affirmative action, and they want to believe racism is there, and we know racism is not there. Even I know that. And if I know it, everybody should know it.
Okay, thank you very much. So what we're going to do, I do have some questions that I'm going to throw out in the universe, but before we do that, I'm going to ask each of our panelists, and also Professor, you as well, if there is any comment that you have heard already that you want to reflect upon by your peers, whether it's pro or con. Any of you want to reflect on anything you have heard here so far today?
I'm not a political person. I'm a professor and academician. But one of the things that I would say is that there are concrete, tangible, and also intangible benefits of the presidency of Obama. The fact that we have somebody in its type, a nature in White House, I think has motivated a lot of African-American young men and women to know that it is possible in our lifetime.
Thank you. Anyone else? What about Professor Marie Christine? Is there anything you want to reflect upon that you have already heard here today?
Well, there's one thing I would like to comment upon. The last speaker, Mr. Williams, he's absolutely right in the sense that the election of Barack Obama was perceived in your country, in European countries, as the advent of a post-racial society. It was totally misinterpreted here, and I must tell you, I have a hard time convincing my students of the reality of the American structure today, of the American society, and the prevalence of racism and the prevalence of covert and ambiguous and subtle racism in the U.S. today. So I think he's very right to point out that the election of Barack Obama has been very ambiguous and very ambivalent, because it delegitimizes racism and, of course, all the measures taken to fight all the anti-discrimination measures. So this is one comment I wanted to bring to the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, one of the questions that we have that the panels have been asked to think about is, has diversity been effective? Oh, yes.
Can I have all the panelists respond to the last speaker's statement? Only because I know it is, it's a challenging way of how we look at the election of Barack Obama.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like everyone, especially speakers, since you represent groups, significant groups in terms of what you do, and how you perceive or how you would interpret the statements of the last speaker. And Mr. Williams, am I correct? Mr. Williams?
Yeah.
I agree with you. I think we're afraid to say to a brother or sister, especially anyone who moves up the ladder, that I disagree with you, or I think something's wrong. So I just want comment from everyone, because you are important.
Well, let me just say this. What I do want to give panelists an opportunity to do, that they would, I'm just going to ask who would like to make a comment on what the last speaker said, all right, rather than mandating that each of them kind of come out of the closet and say what they feel about it. So are there
pretty good.
any other speakers here who would like to make a comment? Thank you.
Sure. So I mentioned earlier that I work for the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. It's a coalition of 200+ organizations. We are family. We are across many different constituencies, and we also have very difficult conversations at times. But we're in it together, and we have common principles, and we agree to work together around those principles. I definitely think, just in responding to those comments, that the election of Barack Obama did present some unique challenges, whereas we lifted up as examples of what opportunity can provide, what opportunity can look like. If you do have opportunity for higher education, for employment, see what can happen as an example of successful affirmative action. Whereas we would lift that up, there are others, right, who would lift it up and say, oh, this means, we're now in a post-racial society. And that is the biggest challenge that's facing many of us who do work on these policies, not only at the national level, but at the state level. As it relates to the president's commitment to affirmative action, I think it's safe to say for those of us who advance and want to advance policies around equal opportunity, specific to affirmative action and enforcement, civil rights enforcement, we always feel whoever's in office can do a better job. We always want them to make it their #1 priority. I do want to acknowledge that when the Recovery Act, ARA, was passed, there was language that was added through the White House and through their leadership by executive order that strengthened the language in there around equal opportunity and affirmative action, mandating that contractors who are applying for those Recovery Act funds would have to go through the process and make sure that they're qualified through the EEO laws. Again, there are opportunities that the president, I believe, has taken to show his commitment and to talk about the importance of this issue. Again, is it to the level that we all would like him to do day in and day out? Probably not, just in the reality of the time and the climate, as Mr. Williams mentioned. I also want to mention the way we're talking about this issue right now and the way we're talking about the president and the challenges that we now have in discussing these issues. It's very different at the state level. People at the state level don't make the distinctions that we make on this panel between affirmative action, diversity, equal opportunity, civil rights enforcement. They lump it all in together, and it's up to us as advocates when we're working with them to educate them on the differences, on what it means to have these policies in their higher ed institutions, in their local city offices, and across the state. So, yeah.
Is there anyone else?
I'm going to venture to say a few words here. I'm a little concerned with the idea that this is an issue that is just one group's issue over another group's issue. I'm a little concerned with the idea that white women, are receiving positive treatment versus other groups. From our perspective, and I do come from the EEOC originally, it's a big pie, and it's not as if one group gets a portion of that pie, there's not any left for everybody else. When we look at this, I think it's important that we keep the discussion about everyone. It is about race. It is about national origin. It's also about socioeconomics. It's about sexual orientation. It's about gender identity. There are a lot of groups who are not part of the main power system. And I think that if we leave those groups out of the discussion, we're actually missing an opportunity, because as long as we see ourselves as so different, we're never going to have the strength that we would have if we come together on these issues, and that really does concern me. What I can also tell you is, working in the federal government, all the different agencies hear from all the different affinity groups, as we can call them sometimes, constituencies. We hear the same criticisms we've always heard, because we don't meet everyone's needs, and we know that we don't, and we try very hard to try to address the concerns as a whole, understanding that we will always fall somewhat short of what we should be doing and hoping to improve each and every time. So I just wanted to clarify those two things, but a real concern on my part, probably even most as an individual, is that as long as we pit this as an us versus them, we're never going to get the result we really are all looking for, which is fairness and equity.
But, however, you cannot ignore the reality of the facts. And I'm speaking as a conservative. I'm surprised at my role today. To tell me that when the President of the United States had a chance to appoint someone to the Supreme Court, knowing no black woman in the history of the Supreme Court has never served, you could not find one? I can understand the first time. But the second time, again, not one, I'm sorry. The bottom line is the results do not match the reality. You may be uncomfortable with it, and that's a good thing, because maybe you will do something about it. Because obviously, you're benefiting, and the majority of, I'll leave it alone. I'll leave it there. I don't want to divide, but I want us to be honest. If you want results, you got to be honest. One thing about us in the party, we hold their feet to the fire. They may not, you all may not like Justice Thomas, we did. We will not allow those Republicans not to back down from that brother. And he's on that court today. You may not like him, but he's on that court. Say what you may. Okay?
And you're right. Yes.
As the president of this association, I really have to make a comment, and it's probably only 3 Republicans in the room, me and this fella here in Armstrong. And the truth of the matter is, affirmative action, regardless to race or gender, it is about access, it's about equity, it's about opportunity for everybody. And I think what happens sometimes is that we have people who have their bully pulpit and they divide us by making it a racial issue in particular. And if the President of the United States did something as far as this association is concerned, we have absolutely no problem challenging that. We have had occasion to do that. Regardless to who you are, we will not whisper because it's a brother or it's a sister, because that's not our mission. Because if we do that, then we defeat our own purpose. But I understand what you're saying, but it's our responsibility to challenge anybody regardless to who they are.
Well, the beauty is, I came to say my piece, and I'm going to say it. That's why we have this debate.
And we want you to continue saying your
Oh,
piece.
I will. That's why I'm here. I didn't come all the way not to say, hold my peace, not today. Make somebody uncomfortable? Tough. That's why we're here.
Can I add something?
Yes,
Just for a
please,
second.
Robin.
One of the things that I think is interesting, if you back way up in a historical context about, well, what are the effects of race and racism or any other kind of oppression on a people, right? And one of the things that you find over and over again is that it will tend to pit people against each other, people who should be natural allies. It happened when slaves were divided, some in the house, some in the field. And you see it happening perhaps even as part of our discussion here. I'm not as well equipped as some to say how well President Barack Obama has done on affirmative action. But I do know that there's only so much the President of the United States, who is a black man, can do. And so I just wonder how much, we waste our time, as it were, focusing on Barack Obama as the problem, instead of what I would perceive as a real problem, which is how is it that 90% of the people in the United States feel about affirmative action and why it's dying? I have this feeling that whether Barack Obama loved affirmative action, stood on a mountain and yelled about affirmative action, passed out buttons saying that he endorsed it, it wouldn't change how most people feel about it. And therefore, I don't know whether we should create him as the problem as we begin to talk about this issue.